It's been a jam-packed weekend here at Park East, and since Tanis Esther, I guess, pre-Purim and all the way through Purim and all the way through the special Shabbat, the Rabbi Schneier celebration weekend. But before letting go of this special weekend, I thought it would be fun and worthwhile to pause on Purim and to reflect just a drop more about Megillat Esther. It looks like some people are still being admitted, so let me just wait one more second. Maybe if somebody could just give me a thumbs up that they hear me. Okay, great. Thank you. Worked perfectly. So what I want to try to do in the time allotted this evening, I'm going to try to end by 8 the latest, is to look at some artwork relevant to the Purim story that really focuses on one chapter, and that is chapter 6 of the Esther Megillah. And I feel like, we all read the Megillah year after year, and we know it and we love it. And there are still nuances in it that I think each year I come across. And that's probably why we repeat it each year, twice a year. So I want to try to share an insight that maybe will highlight a new perspective in the Esther story. And even though Purim's behind us, I think its message has meaning beyond just the holiday of Purim, but really is an ongoing message which resonates to a certain extent with some contemporary politics. That's a bit of a loose connection. That's this intriguing title, Mordechai, Rembrandt, and Zelensky. So let's start really with the artwork. And even with the artwork, a keen eye pointed out that the poster, if you saw the poster, the painting's not even Rembrandt. And in a way, that wasn't an accident. We went with the painting that worked best as a graphic. We'll see that painting, but in truth is, while I will focus a drop more on a Rembrandt, my point that I want to talk about, or the flaw, has less to do with Rembrandt, but rather with a series of paintings. So I'll get to that in turn. So let me just begin with the earliest visual depiction of Megillat Esther. I mean, this is just stunning. We're talking about a 3rd century CE illustration in Dura-Europos, which is, sort of Syria, Turkey, and it's one of the great ancient synagogues that have been found. A massive synagogue that dates back to the 13th century, found in the 3rd century, CE, found in the early 20th century. And I don't want to take time to look at the mural tonight. Maybe we'll have the opportunity another time to look at the different murals. But this is a 3rd century CE mural depiction of the Esther story. Moreover, relevant to us, and that's why I did decide to just begin with it for a second, is on the left-hand side of your screen, where you see, I would ask, I'm going to do more lecture tonight. On Tuesday nights, it's more interactive. Tonight, it's going to be more of a lecture. If people have comments, you can put in the chat. And at the very end, if there's any time, I'll try to look at what's in the chat. If not, please email me, and I'll try to respond when I get a chance. But you see on the left-hand side, somebody on a horse being led. And we also know from inscriptions who the characters are here, but once we know this is associated with Purim, we get it. That's Mordechai on the horse being led by Haman. It's amazing, right, to have a mural that lasted from the 3rd century CE. And that's really the theme I want to follow in visual art through certain representations. The theme of chapter 6 of Megillat Esther, which is, of course, the famous chapter where King Ahasuerus is having a hard time. He's an early insomniac, right? We have recorded. It's not just us contemporaries with all our anxieties that we have insomnia. Ahasuerus had insomnia. And as a result, we know what happened, that eventually they get a Megillah, they get a record of the chronicles of what happened in Sefer Zichronot, things that happened in the Persian Empire, and he realizes that he owes a big favor to somebody, and he calls in Haman, and Haman says, This is the way you really show honor to somebody. You give them a royal parade, and then, of course, Achashverosh says, exactly, now do that, exactly what you just prescribed, and do it to Mordechai. He's the one who gets this royal parade. So this makes its way into artwork, and just briefly, again, some of this artwork I'm just going to go through briefly, mostly artwork, just briefly. This is an Italian, an early Renaissance depiction of the trial. This is an early modern, this is an Italian Renaissance depiction of the trial of, an early Renaissance depiction of the parade of the triumph of Mordechai, Mordechai being led through Shushan by Haman. And here we have a later Renaissance depiction. Again, I apologize, I'm doing this quickly. Each artwork deserves more careful just appreciation and dissection. But what I'm trying to show is that already from the earliest visual depictions, this scene from chapter 6 grabbed the imagination. Mordechai being paraded around by Haman. We could imagine why this was an intriguing scene to try to visualize. It really is one of the great moments in the Megillah, such a graphic moment. We could almost visualize it ourselves when we're reading the Megillah. That's why in the 3rd century CE it was already depicted. And in Renaissance, both early and late Renaissance art, it's also depicted. At some point, I actually might need to switch to a different PowerPoint, but let's go forward with this one. What I want to take note of, just more briefly, is the Dutch paintings, the Dutch renditions of this scene. Because it's interesting that in Holland, in the Dutch renditions, we find, I'm sorry, I apologize if you see I'm just a little thrown. I want to get to a different version of this PowerPoint, so just bear with me 1 second. Sorry for the technical difficulty. And let me just pull up the version that's slightly more updated. Sorry. 1 second. Yeah, let's go with that. 1 second. This is the version I want. Hold on. So let's see. Yeah. Okay, very good. So sorry. If anybody, let me regroup for 1 second. My apologies for the technical difficulties. Is this being shared? Are we good on the share on this? I'm just not seeing the Zoom participants. Yes, that version. And then let's just start from the beginning, please. Okay. Now that is the wrong version. Sorry, technical difficulties for 1 minute, people. I'm sorry. All you wonderful congregants, just give us 1 second. I have a great staff here who's trying to just I want to pull up this version. This is the version. Okay, let's just make sure. Seems to keep on snapping into the other one. Okay, I'm going to go forward. So it's not so important. I'm just recapping. Sorry for the choppy intro. the basic idea is I want to show that in visual art, chapter 6 of Megillah was a fond scene to try to render in visual arts. So it's the scene of Mordechai parading around on the horse and being led by Haman. So that is a scene that's depicted in Dura-Europos in 3rd century CE, and then we see it also in Renaissance art. But what I'm curious about is to try to focus in on how a certain series of paintings are rendered in the Dutch lands. And this seems to be not coincidental. So here, just a brief comment from an excellent scholar who's worth being familiar with his work, Stephen Nadler. And Stephen Nadler has not just written about Rembrandt, he's written about Spinoza and excellent works on really 17th century figures connected often to Holland, Dutch lands, etc. So also Menashe ben Israel. He's an excellent scholar. So Stephen Nadler says the following: the Dutch identification with ancient Israel and their own fight for freedom from Spanish tyranny and Catholic persecution found a particular original expression in the popularity of the Esther story in Dutch culture. The tale of Esther looms large and assumes great significance. It appears as a theme in the literature and visual arts of the Netherlands in the 17th century more often than anywhere else at any other time in history. Okay, so that's really fascinating. If you were to ask a trivia question, when is Esther visualized, drawn, painted more often than anywhere else in the history of the West? The answer, according to Nadler, is 17th century Holland. The audience would easily recognize in the figure of Haman with his idolatrous demands as a representative of Spain. Esther and Mordecai on the hand were clearly personifications of the virtuous, pious Dutch. So what Nadler's saying is that it's not coincidental that the Esther story loomed large in Holland in the 17th century. We know the 17th century was a period of dramatic political transformation in Netherlands. That's the period of the great wars with Spain, the 80 Years' War with Spain, which ultimately led to Dutch independence of the Dutch provinces, the United Provinces of Holland. And so it's a throwing off of Spanish imperial rule, royal rule, Catholic rule, and a replacement with the Netherlands, the Protestant provinces of Netherlands that very much was not a royalist land. And it's a land also, because of all its transformations, which had a significant Jewish community, right? It had the Jews from Spain, the exiles from Spain, found the homeland in Netherlands in the 17th century, and also an Ashkenazi community developed and eventually flourished in the 17th century. So it was a transformative period in the 17th century. And what's interesting and not obvious is that the Book of Esther somehow became very important in the 17th century, not just to Jews. To Jews, scholars point out, it probably was important beyond the way it's important to all of us at all times. But maybe the idea of living in a foreign land and, sort of in ways where your identity is a bit concealed, but then asserting your Jewish identity and then finding prominence. The story of Esther probably resonated for 17th century Spanish Jews and Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. But it also, and that's the point of Nadler here, the Nadler quote is talking about the importance of Esther also for Gentiles, and even in their political identity, in their fight against Spain. They even associated, Nadler's saying, based on all sorts of evidence, they associated Haman with the Catholic Spanish royalty, and they associated Esther and Mordecai with their Dutch fight for independence from Spanish rule and trying to wrestle out their own independence from Spanish rule. So that's not so crucial for where I want to go tonight, but I just did want to give a little background for why in the 17th century and the 16th century you find because I'm going to go back to the 16th century, or even for a second, 15th century, 15th, 16th, and even more so 17th century, you find various Dutch paintings of Esther. And I want to focus on Dutch paintings of Esther chapter 6. So let's get looking at some of the artwork. So here you have, I skipped that one painting, that's fine. Here you have a 15th century, just a manuscript depiction from, which is found in a library in The Hague, of Mordechai being led by Haman. Okay, and I don't have time to really pause on each painting, but let me just leave it there for a second just to take it in. It's really a beautiful, graphic rendition. Here we start to get the paintings I want us to pay a little bit more attention to. This is Lucas van Leyden, who you see the year, 1515. And notice what this work is called, because that's going to be very important. The work is called The Triumph of Mordecai. Just a word on titles of artworks. I'm no expert on artwork in general, and certainly not on the titles. But from what I understand, we cannot, maybe somebody here in the audience could help us at some point or add or illuminate further. But in general, I think artworks, their titles, we're not sure exactly when they were given. Were they given by the painter, or if it's a print, or were they given later? And often I think until like 18th, 19th century, where, it could be that the producer did not give the title. It could be the artist didn't give the title. And even we'll get to Rembrandt, we know that he didn't always give titles to his works. But sometimes they did give titles, and in the last, I think, 200 years or so, we could speak more confidently that the titles in general were given by the artist. But here I couldn't figure this out 100% in the time I had to prep, but my sense is this becomes the title of this scene. And that's very important for what I want to talk about. The title is The Triumph of Mordechai. So again, I can't be certain when the first time that title came out. Maybe if I had more time to dig around, we could try to sort of support, but it seems like that becomes the scene that's being depicted. Esther chapter 6, the parade of Mordechai, where Haman leads Mordechai through Shushan, the triumph of Mordechai. So this is a Dutch painting, a rendition in 1515. Notice, I'll come back. Here is a painting. This was on the poster that we used. This is from Peter Lastman, who is a more known figure because he is one of Rembrandt's mentors. And you see here how he also paints this depiction of Mordechai on the horse being led by Haman. Obviously, in the imagination or the envisioning of this great early 17th century artist. And again, we'll get a little to details, but I want to save the details for when we get to Rembrandt. But of course, you notice interesting things like the background building all the way to, rendered towards the back right, which seems like a classical building. And you see the statues and other things there in the background. But I'll say a word about that more in a second. And here we get to the Rembrandt. The Rembrandt is a print. So that's why it might be a little harder for you to make out the details. And in a sense, I could have focused on any of the paintings, but it just, we're all, I think, a little partial to Rembrandt, and given his, his brilliance and his fame, and also his interesting relationship with biblical scenes and with Jews, is always fascinating to look at. So here we have Rembrandt's rendition of The Triumph of Mordechai. Okay, and it seems pretty clear that Rembrandt is working off of some of these earlier models. That's certainly what a lot of scholars say, that, even though he's, of course, visualizing and depicting the scene in his uniquely Rembrandt way, he is drawing on some of these earlier Dutch renditions. So let me just focus in briefly on some elements here. You see these figures, right? These figures, if you notice, they have a similarity. Let's go back to the figures over here. If you look at towards the bottom right, if you look the bottom right, the kneeling individual and then the individual all the way to the right raising his hat. So they are similar to, there's the figure raising a hat and there's the kneeling individual. Okay, maybe I'll go back one more time just to show you. So it seems pretty clear here. There's the kneeling individual towards the right, and then even more towards the right, the individual raising his hat. So these seem to be, possible sources of inspiration for some of the figures here. Although, again, Rembrandt depicts them in his own way. A little to the right of, in that top oval, the individual who's raising his hat, you have what seems to be clearly an Ashkenazic Jew, a contemporary Ashkenazic Jew wearing a prayer shawl, with his beard, wearing a prayer shawl. So, this is, scholars, I think, assume, art historians, that he's drawing on Rembrandt on, the Ashkenazic Jews that he encountered in Amsterdam. And we mentioned before Menashe ben Israel, he had connections to Jewish communities, Sephardic Jewish communities, but also he got to know Ashkenazic Jews. And then there's up here, who's up there? So that is a Rembrandt edition of Achashverosh and Esther. Okay, in the balcony over there. Now that's fascinating, because if you look at Esther chapter 6, there's no Achashverosh and Esther. Achashverosh is an insomniac, calls in Haman. It instructs Haman to parade around Mordechai. But there's no indication in the text, of course, that at the parade, it's a parade before, in the royal balcony in front of Achashverosh and Esther. And there might be certain details here about his depiction of Achashverosh that are interesting, but I don't want to get into that too much. But scholars, art historians point out, there's sort of, it's hard to, you really need to see it magnified even further to pick up on some of those details. But I might return to that, because it's interesting that he adds other characters to the scene. It's not impossible, right? He's certainly entitled to add them. First of all, artistic license, and of course the royal parade, maybe Achashverosh and Esther were observing it, but the Megillah doesn't talk about that. And then one other element that it's actually an important element, but I'm not going to elaborate, but I do want to point out, is this. Now we saw that building more or less in probably something similar in Lastman. There in the right, it's not identical, but it's sort of this oval type structure in the back right. So if you get to, he also has this structure. And you could piece together from other pieces of artwork what that structure is. That structure is his rendering of the Jerusalem temple. And it would take more artwork. Again, I'm leaning here on art historians, but you see it's sort of the shape a bit of the Dome of the Rock, which is very fascinating, that a lot of graphic representations in 16th, 17th century of the Jerusalem temple sort of assume that the dome, the mosque on the Temple Mount is what the temple looked like. So let's just go with that for a second. Again, it's not so important for where I want to head, but just to point out what Rembrandt seems to be doing here is he seems to be linking this story of in Shushan to Jerusalem, which is really fascinating, as if, Mordechai's triumph, the triumph of Mordechai, eventually leads to the building of a second temple, or some scholars say this is really an allusion to a sort of a Christian motif of a millennial motif of a third temple, because there was, among the Protestants of the 17th century, there was an anticipation of the second coming of Christ in a new Jerusalem. So all of that is interesting, but sort of gets beyond where I want to go. So I have a challenge enough to try to talk about Mordechai, Rembrandt, and Zelensky. So let me summarize so far where we're at, and then a little bit where I want to head. Well, let me just show you one more thing, and then I'll summarize. That if you look in the next paintings, you see that Rembrandt had other sketches that I think scholars assume these are preparatory works for the more famous one we just saw, the print, The Triumph of Mordechai. So here you see sort of the gates that we saw over here, there's an arch, there's a gate. And this is an earlier drawing of Rembrandt, where he's starting to play with these ideas. And you see the gate, and you see on top, that's the balcony that then he moves to the right side, where he puts Achashverosh and Esther. And then over here, you have a more proximate drawing. It's about 1640 that I think is often thought to be Rembrandt also. And, just interesting where it is. It's in Lvov and Lemberg that we're reading about, sadly, in the news in Ukraine. If you see over here, you see there in the background, this doesn't have the gate and all that, but you see in the background the structure where we're talking about that dome building, which is assumed to be a rendition of a representation of the third temple. Okay, so let me just go back one more time. Let's just sit with this image, and I want to move from Rembrandt. I want to summarize where we are and where I want to head, the main points. I try to throw some other things in along the way. Maybe that made it a drop more diffuse, my presentation so far, but it's too interesting not to touch on some of this stuff. So we talked about, let's just summarize the main points. That there were graphic representations of the Megillah already from the 3rd century CE, including depictions of the Esther chapter 6 episode of the parade where Mordechai is paraded around by Haman. And that continues to resurface in late medieval and early modern times, or first we saw Italian, just briefly, we saw early Renaissance and late Renaissance depictions of this parade. And then we got to these Dutch depictions, which started to have a title. And while we can't guarantee, it does seem that title became part of what was being depicted. And of course, I'm emphasizing that because that's going to be important for where I want to head. These are either prints or paintings of the triumph of Mordechai. And then we looked here at Rembrandt's painting in particular, and we saw how he drew on his mentor's painting and an earlier Dutch painting, but also added his own elements. Among the elements that are particularly fascinating, one, an insertion of a contemporary Ashkenazic Jew, two, the addition of Achashverosh and Esther on the balcony observing the parade, three, that what seems to be the Jerusalem temple, which is either a sort of building on certain midrashim or a Christian sort of anticipation of a third temple, the second coming of Christ. But the other thing I want to just focus, which I didn't say yet, is that the way he's painting it, right, using that arch, he's really focusing in on Mordechai and Haman, right? That really are the figures that, rightly get the most attention. It's interesting he added other figures like Achashverosh and Esther, but they're being framed there. And especially, I would say, Mordechai is being framed. You could sort of ask, like, who are the figures that are most important here? It's Mordechai and Haman. Is one more important than the other? I guess we could discuss. To me, somehow you see Mordechai a little bit more. Just one other detail that I read in one work characterizing this, which I thought is interesting, is if you look, there are people bowing on the left and on the right. Actually, they didn't say it exactly this way, but to me, the people bowing on the left might be bowing to bottom left, might be bowing to Haman, right? Everybody's supposed to bow down to Haman, right? That's how the way the problems all began, when Mordechai didn't bow down to Haman. While the people on the right might be giving sort of, it might be his gesture of reverence to Mordechai. Those who are a little more in the dark there on the bottom left, and those who are a little more illuminated a little more, clearer and brighter on the right. There's actually, if you look on the left, there seems to be somebody carrying a whip. He's sort of making people bow down. So maybe coercing people to bow down to Haman, while there are people who are already showing sort of a gesture on the right, like where I have the circle on the bottom circle there, showing more pious reverence towards Mordechai. Okay, so the main thing, though, again, I want to talk about is not just all the beautiful and such a rich imagery, but I want to pick on one thing in this series. And as I hinted at, it has something to do with the title. So what's my beef with the title? There are some other elements beyond the title that I think are worth pondering, but especially the title. There was this just one characterization I came across in a curator's pamphlet around a recent exhibition, 2019 in Savannah, Georgia, of some Rembrandt biblical imagery. And I liked what he said, but I thought it was an interesting point of departure for where I want to head. He says the following about this print. In The Triumph of Mordechai, another engraving in the Telfair exhibition depicting a scene from the Book of Esther, Rembrandt imagines the moment the tide changed for the Persian Jews. And here's the point where I want to get into the Megillah a bit, right? This statement that this scene, chapter 6, the parade, where Mordechai is on the horse and Haman parades him around Shushan, is the turning point for the Jews. The tide changes in the Megillah. And that really raises an interesting question I want to think about. And that is sort of captured in a series of articles that I came across years ago. And the articles were interesting. They were asking the following question. They're written in Hebrew in a nice journal called Megadim. I don't know if maybe some of you have heard of Megadim. Megadim is an excellent Bible journal put out by the Shiva Har Tzion or Gush Etzion, by one of their wings. And they had this, issue years ago where there was a person who wrote an article, R.L. Segal, who he wrote in Hebrew, but I translated it in English. Just the opening, the title of his piece, it's a short piece because it's a response piece, is what is the significance hamashmaut shel harkavat Mordechai Lasus? What's the significance of chapter 6 of Megillat Esther? What's that scene doing in Megillat Esther? And he points out that the reason it's a response piece is he read 3 other scholars who took a stab at it, and he wasn't satisfied with what they said. And I have to say, the 3 other scholars are all excellent scholars. 2 of them, one's an excellent professor. 2 of them actually are excellent professors at Bar Ilan University, really brilliant scholars. And he had to, so they gave 3 accounts of what's really the significance of the parade scene with Mordechai on the horse being led by Haman. And he adds a fourth explanation. And then I saw somebody add a fifth explanation. And I'm sure if I could unmute everybody and we had time, I'd hear interesting accounts from people in the audience. But let me just pause before I continue. The question is, right, just to summarize where we're at, I know I read you summarized, but I want to really get to the main sort of content point I want to get to tonight. And that is, there's this motif in literary art, which is representing chapter 6 of Megillat Esther, which is a great scene, and we see how it lends itself to the visual imagination, and that is Mordechai on the horse being paraded around by the evil Haman, where suddenly the topsy-turvy, the nahafochu, the turnabout of the Megillah, where Mordechai, who was the part of the Jewish people who were on the brink of extinction, suddenly he's on top, and Haman is, the powerful Haman is, debased. So we get the scene and we get how it's so sort of pregnant with symbolism. But beyond the symbolism, I just sort of gave it something it's doing. It's giving you a symbolic depiction of where things are going to head. But beyond the sort of the symbolism, you could ask, is it really an important chapter? What's that chapter doing in the plot? Does the chapter play an important role in the plot? That's what's bugging these scholars. They're all asking the question, like, let's say we never had chapter 6. Sometimes this happens with ancient works where they're, think Dead Sea Scrolls, they're sometimes fragments. So sometimes you lose some of the original scroll. Imagine you lost chapter 6. When things change, is chapter 6 important? It's sort of hogging a very central part of the storyline. Chapter 6, how many chapters is Megillat Esther? 10 chapters. So just in the very layout, we know that Megillat Esther is, very, I think, a well-crafted story. Chapter 6 seems to be a focal point. And it does seem to sort of signal a change of fortunes. But beyond the sort of just a premonition, a signaling a change of fortunes, is it an important chapter? Okay, I don't think we can ask that about certain other chapters. Mordechai not bowing down is very important, because without him not bowing down, there wouldn't be the whole threat against the Jews, right? When it comes to Esther and the banquets in chapter 7, that's really important. That's when she rats out Haman, and that leads to his being hung. So most of the chapters we get are important. What is chapter 6 important? In what way can we try to give a little more texture to our answer? So I want to look together at chapter 6 briefly. And I want to point out one basic point about chapter 6. Just the background here is, I brought in the Hebrew on the right-hand side and the English on the left-hand side. I'm going to do it in the Hebrew with my own translation, but you can follow along in the English. It begins with the insomniatic Achashverosh, who then looks at his records, as we said, and recalls that Mordechai did him a great favor, saved his life. And then he's trying to figure out how should he reward him. And behold, Haman walks in. And Achashverosh asks Haman, I'm not even reading it, so I'm just repeating the story we know well. What should be done with a person who the king wants to shower favor and honor and glory on? That's chapter 6, verse 7. And then verse 8. So Haman's answer is, bring the royal guards, the Lavush Malchut, and bring the horse, the king's horse, and bring the king's crown. And you should put all those things on the person, and you should march him through the city and call before him, proclaim, this is the way to show honor, right? And then, of course, we have the continuation. And here, let's look at the verses a little more carefully. So the king says to Haman, okay, do that, execute that plan, exactly right, but you execute it, and Mordechai is going to be the beneficiary. Right, so here we're getting to the scene of the triumph of Mordechai, right? These are the verses which depict the triumph of Mordechai. And now I want you to notice something. Verse 11. And Vayikach Haman, Haman took the horse. Vayalbesh, Haman dressed Mordechai. Vayarkivehu, Haman led Mordechai through the streets. Vayikra lefanav, Haman proclaimed before Mordechai. Something is striking about this verse. This is the royal parade. This is the so-called triumph of Mordechai. And what do you notice when you look at the verse carefully, verse 11 of chapter 6? That there's only one subject in the verse, and that's Haman. The entire verse is what Haman did. Vayikach Haman, Haman took. Vayalbesh, Haman dressed, right? That's even such a strange formulation. Vayalbesh, right? And not lavash. Vayalbesh, Vayikach Haman, Haman took. Vayalbesh, he dressed Mordechai. Vayarkivehu, Haman led Mordechai. Vayikra lefanav, Haman proclaimed. In other words, there's one protagonist, really. There's only one subject. The subject is Haman. In other words, I'm picking on the title, The Triumph of Mordechai, because it's not, chapter 6 is not about Mordechai. No, it's not only am I taking issue with Rembrandt adding figures like Achashverosh and Esther. I'm always saying Mordechai is not a subject, he's an object. There's only one subject in chapter 6, and that's Haman. And Haman does to Mordechai. And the confirmation that this reading is correct, that this is all about Haman's downfall. It's all about Haman's debasement. It's that Haman needs to take, again, by subject, I'm not saying subject in a positive way. It's humiliating. He's a humiliating protagonist. He's a humiliated protagonist, right? He needs to take the horse. He needs to dress his arch nemesis, right? His nemesis. He needs to lead him, and he needs to call out compliments before him. This is the title of this chapter is The Humiliation of Haman. And the proof is the next verse. Because what do we see in the next verse? The aftermath. What's the aftermath of this episode? Well, let's begin with the latter half of the verse. What happens to Haman? Nitchaf el beito evel v'chafui rosh. Right? And the verse uses such powerful language, rhetorically charged language. Haman is mourning, like mourning over himself, over his ego, over his shattered ego. For Haman, this is a dramatic downfall. And what about for Mordechai? That's the poignance of this verse. And from Mordechai, where does he return? To the gate. What gate? The very gate he was before chapter 6, right? If you remember, where did he hang out when Esther was in the palace? He hung out in the gate. Both before chapter 6 and at the end of chapter 6, Mordechai is in exactly the same place. But for Haman, chapter 6 is devastating. Now, that's my slight response to the 5 different scholarly theories of chapter 6. I would argue the following about chapter 6. Is chapter 6 an important chapter? Again, chapter 6 is about the parade and about Haman marching Mordechai around. Is that an important chapter? And my answer would be the following. Depends for whom. For Haman, this is a devastating chapter. This is when the world comes crushing down around him, and we could just anticipate chapter 7 is the death knell. Because he's already mourning in chapter 6 for himself. And for Mordechai, chapter 6 is irrelevant. It's an irrelevant chapter. Where he was before chapter 6 and after chapter 6 is exactly the same place. Worried and anxious at the gates of Shushan. Nothing has changed. Now, I just want to go one step further to show, I think, the deliberate construction of the Megillah. Because we do find the verse, exactly the perfect verse, where Mordechai is the subject and is triumphant, does celebrate the triumph of Mordechai in a great pageantry, in a great parade. That's not in chapter 6. That comes in chapter 8. In chapter 8, look at this famous verse that we know because we say it each year. What's this verse saying? Mordechai going out before the royal entourage, wearing royal garbs, and the entire Shushan is applauding his great triumph. But that's only in chapter 8. In other words, just to make this a little bit more vivid, I want to make up a chapter that doesn't exist. It's an eclectic hybrid of chapter 6 and chapter 8. It's not perfect because it would take a little editing, but I'll just give you a sense. And that is here. I'm jumping around between chapter 6 and chapter 8. Again, this is an eclectic test. This doesn't exist. I'm making this up. Haman, let's just follow what I put here. Haman, following Achashverosh's instructions, puts the royal garments on Mordecai and readies the horse. Then we could skip to the triumph of Mordecai, and Mordecai marches around Shushan. And then we could weave back to what Haman was doing. He was calling before him. And then we could say, and all of Shushan was watching. I just want to be clear, maybe I'm confusing you by what I'm doing here. What I'm trying to show is, here's really just the two parts of my thesis. One part of my thesis is that chapter 6 is all about Haman's debasement and is relevant for Mordechai. And then I'm saying Mordechai's triumph is only chapter 8. And I'm saying the Megillah, in a sense, wants us to appreciate how verse 8:15, right? 8:15 really is missing from chapter 6 and is deferred to chapter 8. Because we could have imagined verse 8:15 in the account of the parade of chapter 6. We could have imagined Achashverosh is sleepless. He wants to give honor to Mordechai. Haman walks in, gives him the exact blueprint for how to give honor. Achashverosh tells Haman, that's exactly what you should do. Haman, devastated, has to go along with what Achashverosh instructed him. And Mordechai's on top and celebrates. And he's walking around Bilvush Malchut because that is what he was doing. Right? In chapter 6, he was Bilvush Malchut. He was wearing royal garbs, and we could even describe the royal garbs in all their splendor, in their colors, in their majesty. And Haman had to do his lowly part, and all of Shushan is watching this crazy spectacle, right? Had all of this been in chapter 6, we would not have blinked. But my point is, we're supposed to notice that it's missing from chapter 6. What's missing from chapter 6? Mordechai's glee and glory, his triumph. Or another way to make my point. You could make a painting of the triumph of Mordechai, but that would be a painting of Megillat Esther chapter 8, not Megillat Esther chapter 6. If you were to ask me, what's the painting of the triumph of Mordechai? That's Esther 8. But there's only one problem if you painted chapter 8. By that point, Haman has already been hung. Okay, I don't want to confuse, so let me just return to my basic point that I'm trying to emphasize. If you miss my chapter 8 sort of nuance argument, it's not really so important. The larger point that is important is that the parade of chapter 6 is all about the humiliation of Haman, and for Mordechai, it's irrelevant. And Mordechai could only experience triumph in chapter 8. Why? And this point I just need to add, why in chapter 8? And why not in chapter 6? But I think you all know the answer. The answer is obvious. Because in chapter 6, even though Haman is sinking, the Jews are still under the threat of extinction. Nothing about the fate of the Jews has changed. It's only when we get to chapter 8 that Mordechai can celebrate, because he's Mordechai HaYehudi. He's not an individual protagonist, he's a Jew. And he cannot enjoy a parade unless the Jews are parading with him. And that's the next verse. In other words, the description of Mordechai in royal garb parading through Shushan needs to be deferred to chapter 8, because only in chapter 8 do you have Mordechai's triumph along with the Jews' triumph. In other words, there's no painting the triumph of Mordechai. The only painting you could really draw, according to the Megillah, is the triumph of Mordechai, the Jew with the Jews. And with all the beautiful artwork, and I love the artwork the way I'm sure many of you on its own terms, but it's capturing a deeper point in the Megillah, I think it's off the mark. Because the Megillah, I think, is being very precise. Haman is an egomaniac who could experience individual downfall. But Mordechai is of his people, and he could only experience collective triumph. And the artwork is going to have a hard time capturing that asymmetry. It's not a tug of war between two titan individuals. It's Haman, the individual, versus Mordechai, the Jew, and the Jews. So you really need to make two different paintings to be accurate, I think, to the spirit of Megillah. One is the downfall of Haman, that's Esther chapter 6. And the other is the triumph of Mordechai, the Jew, and the Jews, and that needs to wait till Esther chapter 8. Of course, this continues on themes that we know from earlier in the Megillah. The very famous verse that we all know, and that's Mordechai's very pointed, sharp rebuke of Esther, where he tells Esther, don't think you could fade away or hide away in the palace. Your individual subjectivity really has no lasting power. You really are only going to matter as long as you join the collective fate of the Jews. So don't try to write the famous words, Al tadami b'nafshech li malei beit hamelech mikol haYehudim. You cannot offset yourself from the Jews. Your subjective standing doesn't really matter. The question is your role among the Jews. And if you step it up for the Jews, then you will have lasting legacy. And I just want to conclude, and here I'm being a little bit loose, so allow me, by saying that this reminds me a bit of the spirit of President Zelensky. Now, to be clear, as we all know, this is President Zelensky on behalf of the Ukrainians. But he is a Jew, and his Jewish identity has become more to the fore, of course. I would say, I don't want to be so essentialist. There he is, very sort of singular in his posture and his whole persona, obviously extremely brave. I would say that Zelensky, at least in some of the ways he's acting, if it doesn't come from his Jewish DNA, I think at least it's a reflection of a Jewish orientation. His Jewishness has come out in some statements, especially after the bombing of Babi Yar. He spoke to the Jews, addressing all the Jews of the world. again, not being so clear that as a Jew, he's speaking to his fellow Jews. Although this quote I have here from Sharansky, is very striking, where Sharansky, who of course is keen-eye and his unique perspective, I think does matter, how he talks about, towards the end of this quote, that the fact that here you have the person who's the most important president in the history of Ukraine, who's openly Jewish and proud of his Jewish roots, that and connection to Israel, that is really something. And I'm not the first person to try to link Zelensky to the Purim story. Here are just some examples of some headlines to do it. But I would say if there's one moment to me really sort of resonates with what we were talking about tonight is, the tweet that he issued on his behalf on February 26th, when the US government offered to give him safe passageway out of Ukraine. And his response is, at a minimum, is, stunning in its heroic, decline of that offer. And where he said, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride. It's not about my survival. It's about the survival of the collective that I lead." And again, of course, that's on behalf of the Ukrainians, and we know as Jews that Ukraine has had a lot of not difficult chapters vis-a-vis the Jews, but certainly, there's a lot of reason to be very sympathetic. I'm really gonna not get into politics here, but I think a lot of our hearts are open to the people of Ukraine and their tremendous suffering. And when we think about the Purim story, of course, we have to think about them at least this year. But I'm trying to add that in Zelensky's attitude of, it's not about me and it's not about my fate. It's about the fate of the people I lead. In that sense, to me, he is being Mordechai for the people he's leading, because that, I think, is the heart of Mordechai's message, which I think all of us know that on some level, but I hope tonight we added a dimension to that. So just let me take 1 minute to summarize. There's beautiful artwork depicting the Megillah, especially in Holland and the Netherlands in the 17th century. And even the great Rembrandt took various stabs at depicting chapter 6 of Megillat Esther. And that's really in a line of paintings of the triumph of Mordechai. By the way, after Rembrandt into the 17th, 18th century and beyond, you have other great artists who depict the triumph of Mordechai. And I certainly understand and I celebrate that they use their great talents to try to bring to life this amazing scene of chapter 6. But that invited us to think a little bit more, what is going on in chapter 6 of Megillat Esther? Because it's at the heart of the Megillah, and you wonder, how important is it? And what I want to argue tonight is that chapter 6 is critical for Haman's fall, but it's irrelevant for Mordechai. And the reason for that contrast is because Haman, ultimately in the Megillah, is the sort of the consummate egoist, but Mordechai is Mordechai HaYehudi. And Mordechai's identity throughout the Megillah, from the first time we meet him to his words to Esther, to his handling of the parade, is as a Jew. And there's nothing to celebrate in chapter 6. The only celebration comes after the fate of the Jews has turned. And that has to wait till the end of chapter 7 into chapter 8. And then we finally get our deferred moment of the triumph of Mordechai, the Jew, along with all the Jews. We look forward to a lot of triumph and redemption, please God, ahead, where we could celebrate not just individually but collectively the triumph of the Jews. Chag Sameach.